here we go. As people are joining us, I'm sure they won't mind that they're missing bits of the introduction. But once again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight's event. My name is Elena Ivanova. I'm part of the Another Europe is Possible team. We've got a great panel with people joining from all over Europe and the world, because this is not just a crisis in Ukraine, not just a crisis in Russia, not just a crisis in Europe. This concerns all of us. Feel free to share where you're watching from tonight. You can post your location in the chat. Personally, I'm based in Glasgow, where it's dark already. Tonight's event is part of a joint initiative between European Alternatives and Another Europe is Possible. We want to work together with civil society activists in Ukraine and in Russia. We want to build a coalition, and like all coalitions, we don't all think the same. We don't perfectly agree on every point. But we are united in the belief that we need to combine opposition to war and a resounding no to Russian military intervention in Ukraine. But we need to also campaign against authoritarianism, crony capitalism. We need to defend human rights across the world. And we want to resist the still quite popular idea that government is somehow an Eastern problem. This is a world problem. We've seen it with Trump, we've seen it with Brexit, we've seen it in many other examples and many other disguises. We're facing a global problem with democracy, and it requires a civil society response. So tonight we're going to hear from a truly excellent panel, and I'm very excited. I'm very much here to learn from our speakers. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they will be speaking. Alexandra Matvichuk is a human rights lawyer and a civil society activist. She's based in Kiev, where she heads the Center for Civil Liberties. She was the winner of the 2016 OSCE Democracy Defender Award. Dmitri Makarov is the co-chair of the Moscow Helsinki Group. He's a long-standing, the Moscow Helsinki Group is a long-standing civic organization in Russia. And Dmitry himself is a prominent human rights defender. We're hoping that Yulia Yurchenko will be able to join us. Yulia is a senior lecturer in political economy at the Greenwich University and also part of the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. We have Paul Mason with us tonight. Paul is a journalist, an author, a commentator. His latest book is How to Stop Fascism, History, Ideology, Resistance. We have Alvaro Vasconcelos, the founder of Forum Demos and the former director of the European Union Institute for Security Studies. And last but not least, we have Mary Cowder, an emeritus professor of global governance at the London School of Economics, a co-founder of the Helsinki Citizens Assembly in 1990, previously a leading figure with European nuclear disarmament, and very much a cherished part of the Another Europe is Possible National Committee as well. So those are my introductions. I see loads of you are sharing where you're coming from tonight, which is excellent. And I'm going to open the floor and invite Alexandra to speak.
Thank you very much for providing me a floor. I would like to present several theses. I will start with the point that it's appeared that we were not ready for current developments. At the time of the Soviet Union's confrontation with the West, there were politicians in both camps who had survived and remembered the horrors of the Second World War. But there has been a change of generations. War is now seen as a geopolitical tool, and there is no more psychological mechanism of deterrence. Therefore, despite the alerting signals of the Munich speech in 2007, Russia's actions caught everyone by surprise. At present, we see the only diplomats and the military respond to the threats of war. Meanwhile, the society in different countries still doesn't want to leave the zone of comfort. People cling to the old world, which doesn't exist anymore. But the mantra, maybe Putin will change his mind, maybe he was joking, will not work. The role of observers in a world where everything is very interconnected is dangerous for the world itself. One needs to get out of the comfort zone and take a stance. The world needs to find ways to counter the threats of war. It's not about the relation between Russia and Ukraine. It's about the civilizational confrontation between the authoritarianism and democracy. Ukraine is at the forefront of the fight. To counter these threats, we must study the experience of the Cold War because Russia's current leadership follows the same logic. It seems that they want to take us in the past to pay back what they had once lost. But now the Kremlin has fewer resources for the chess party, so they are betting on war. History taught us that wars begins with propaganda, provocation, and hybrid methods. We also know how they end, either with the defeat of one of the parties and enormous human casualties, or with a powerful anti-war movement within the aggressor state. Its members feel that they belong to the broader system, human civilization. We lack the international solidarity movement that can find support in another form, but with the same anti-war appeals in authoritarian Russia itself. I have been defending human rights for about 20 years. I know that there are many things not limited with national borders. I know that freedom is one of them. Only freedom spreading make our world safer. Different institutions may play different roles in deterring and preventing war. People who want peace can work in different ways. There may be different visions, but we must all keep the same pool of values. And as for Ukraine, we have no other choice. Take any recent polls, freedom has always come first for Ukrainians. We will fight with Russia if it launched a new military invasion of the country. We will defend people, our freedom and human dignity. We will defend the values of the free world. And I hope that the world will not just watch this. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra, and we offer our deepest solidarity to you. It must be such a stressful time for you, for your comrades, for everyone you work with. But thank you for coming along tonight and sharing with us. I'm going to turn to Dmitri now.
Yes, hello everyone. It's very nice to see such a diverse crowd. I have to say first two things. I think first we need to realize that this current escalation is not coming out of the blue. And the war in Europe is already a reality. It is already a reality in Ukraine because the war, we're not discussing about the war that's going to start, it has already started. And it's not only a reality in Ukraine, it has been a reality in Georgia, it has been a reality in Nagorno-Karabakh, it has been a reality in Turkey, and we already live in a situation of war in Europe. It's just that it's a different type of war that we used to imagine when we read about World War II conflicts or about some other conflicts in distant parts of the world. It's a war that involves different aspects. And one of those aspects is communication warfare. It's about exploiting weaknesses of the enemy. And in that sense, the enemy is a free and open society. And the weaknesses in that society that the other side of the conflict exploits are connected to corruption, to crony capitalism, to profits over people, and to the same kind of acceptance that war is a legitimate way to resolve conflicts. It's not only an attitude of a crazy Russian dictator, it's also an attitude of some of the NATO leaders. It's also an attitude of some of the authoritarian parties that are in power in some of the European Union member states. So in that sense, if we are to address the current crisis from the anti-war perspective, from the human rights perspective, from the humanitarian perspective, and we need to see a more complex picture, not the picture that some of the Western media and some of the Western politicians paint. I mean, Western also, I mean, West is a strange concept in itself. I mean, but some of the media that is based in Europe, right? But yeah, the picture that they paint is the one that there's an evil Russia, or Russia headed by an evil dictator, and there's a free world that opposes him. The picture is much more complicated than that. And I think on both sides of this imaginary border that we are forced to see, there are people who want peace, there are people who want freedom, and there are people who are willing to set aside differences. But unfortunately, we are also caught up sometimes in our own domestic problems. And it's not only that the Russian civil society has problems, right? Or it's not only that people from Eastern Europe have problems, yeah, in terms of human rights, in terms of freedom, in terms of justice, in terms of equality. A lot of societies that we consider stereotypically more just and more equal are not so just and equal for everyone. And many popular movements demonstrate that. So, I mean, all those problems are common across different sides of that imaginary border that we are drawing. And if we are to think about another Europe that is possible, that does not stop at the European Union border, or does not stop at some imaginary border that we draw through Eastern Partnership states, or whatever they are called in European Union foreign policy, if we dream of another Europe that is based on the values of freedom, human rights, pluralistic democracy, equality, and justice, when we to set aside those differences and think up of an international movements that have those values at the heart. And that movement has been dearly missed. Human rights movement, unfortunately, and I can speak about it with a deep devotion to that concept, but also with a lot of frustration about the state of things, I mean, has not lived up to those expectations. The anti-war movement, which is basically absent as part of this discussion, has not lived up to those expectations. We have all failed. And the sad thing, if we are not to avert that another stage in that ongoing conflict, then what can we build out of it? Can we build out of it some conclusions similar to the conclusions that were drawn out of World War II in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, similar to some of the conclusions that were drawn out of the Helsinki Act and the Helsinki movement, that said that human rights are part of security, that complex security includes not only military buildup or economic stability, that includes also rule of law, it includes also human rights. I mean, those are the lessons out of a Cold War escalation. Can we draw similar lessons, or maybe other lessons out of this escalation? That is a question that we need to be asking ourselves. And I would like to end with just behind me, there was a flag, flag in, I mean, a city in Moscow Helsinki Group, the flag that in Russian says for our and theirs freedom, slogan of Polish freedom fighters against Russian Empire, and then the slogan of Russian dissidents. And it's also a slogan of many human rights and also freedom groups across larger Europe. I think that slogan is still quite ringing today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dmitri. And there's been a lot of discussion on the chat, people agreeing with the perspective and the parallels that you draw between the situation currently and developments in other parts of the world. This is very much a connected global struggle in many ways. I'm going to turn to Yulia now. Apologies, Yulia, for earlier confusion with you joining and not being able to come to the panel, but here you are.
Thank you very much, Alena. Thank you, the organizers. Thank you, everybody who came to this panel and the panelists indeed. This is a very difficult time that we're living in, and it's really humbling to be part of this conversation, and indeed many of these need to happen. There are a lot of aspects, of course, and problems to consider, and for the time constraints, of course, I'm going to have to be selective. So if any of the aspects you would like me to raise questions about, please, by all means, do. And as a Ukrainian living abroad, it's always a difficult time watching these things from afar. But one of the things that outraged me most last week, amongst other, were the remarks from President Biden about graduated sanctions in terms of there being potentially minor or major or whatever other proportion of incursions into Ukraine. And I'm going to also echo some of the things that Dmitri was just now saying about where there are these conversations about, oh, the war may happen. The war is already on, and it's not the only war. So one of the things that I found that really hit a nerve with me was the normalization of border violations, acceptance of existing conflicts as normality, as if we just have to accept that they're there. And we've heard it from certain naval officials from Germany, some of the sentiments that echo through, reverberate through the corridors of power. And I'm sure he was not the only one who had that view that, oh, let's forget about Crimea, let's forget about this, let's forget about that, we're moving on. Well, people who live in the areas that are subject to conflict do not have the kind of option of dismissing them and sweeping them under the carpet and pretending like everything is nice and cheerful now because some time has gone by. So this normalization of conflicts, it's happening before our eyes, and with that kind of the purpose and the premise of international security architecture and mutual assurance principles go out of the window. And indeed, if Ukraine's post-2014 history has taught us anything, is to not be surprised that these kind of statements that there is some sort of graduation apparently to how much border is okay to violate, how many people is okay to kill, and there are also some sort of dismissive attitudes towards certain territories more than of the other. There are a lot of calls we hear about from politicians and in the press about going back to the Minsk agreements. So and that so-called agreement that contributing parties actually find impossible to accept in the case of Ukraine, because those flawed agreements in themselves involve a lot of contradictions, and those contradictions will keep coming back. And this is why we need to look at where they are. If these ongoing conflicts are to be resolved, so there is an ontological inconsistency that undermines any hope for reconciliation from the outset, even if the current threat and saber rattling from Russia were not even on the table. So those agreements, for example, have these irreconcilable interpretations of Ukraine's sovereignty. And I want to speak to the question of Ukraine's sovereignty and the question of peace, specifically in those minutes that are allocated to me. So in the Minsk agreement, for example, the whole question of whether Ukraine is sovereign and in what way it is sovereign is being questioned, because Russia sees that sovereignty is limited and it is stipulated in those agreements. Whereas Ukrainian side sort of Ukrainian government side try to reconstitute Ukraine within the borders of 2013. And therefore there is a paradox in the fact that the agreements around Ukraine's sovereignty interpret the understanding of sovereignty differently, as both an inalienable fact of international relations and law, and as a subject to interpretation in a neo-colonial historical revisionist attempt by Russia. And as a result of this paradox, Russia and Ukraine see the situation at hand for a set of reasons differently, and thus offer an ontologically inconsistent starting point upon which no meaningful compromise can be achieved, let alone when decisions are being made on behalf of Ukraine with its own internal complexity of voices as a proxy. So whether one needs to be seeking compromise as well in a situation where hybrid military aggression is involved is also an important question to ask, but this is not, I do not have time to go into that. Of course, Kremlin continues painting themselves as a victim in the whole situation since 2013, and indeed earlier. But yet it is, and then they use the Ukraine's Russian-speaking population as a pretext for invasion and annexation of Crimea, and support for separatism in Southeast Ukraine, and in the Ukraine, but it is Ukraine's borders and sovereignty that were violated, and Ukrainian citizens who were displaced and wounded, traumatized, and murdered. But we are 8 years deep into all of this, and thus the lens and effectively the solutions to be applied to the current situation need to be different. And again, we see this escalation ramping up of the temperature by Russia, and not only Russia. We're in the UK, and we're all paying attention to what comes out of these lands, but again, we can leave it to discussion later. So there is a lot of ramping up, and then we need to be talking about different solutions that they were potentially in 2014, because we're not talking about the same Ukraine, and we must include the voices and interests of all Ukrainians. Specifically, I want to say that it's important to pay attention to what the working classes first and foremost actually want, and what kind of Ukraine they want to see. And I'm talking here about working classes of all parts of Ukraine in the borders of 2013. If any meaningful plan of what is to be aimed at politically to be developed. There are many aspects to consider here. And again, I'll spend the last minute or two to mention, to speak to the question of sovereignty and the question of peace kind of more broadly. Because when we talk about sovereignty, we do not only talk about borders, we talk about the aspects of economic, political decision making, and they're all being in multiple ways, and yet of course there is nothing more devastating than a military threat to any of those. But yet again, this question of sovereignty dovetails with the question of decision making, which is being denied in terms of geopolitics, in terms of military solutions, in terms of foreign policy solutions, in terms of economic policy solutions, besides that, any meaningful sovereignty for Ukraine or any country is impossible without a stable and relatively independent, resilient, and flexible economic system. And currently, Ukraine again stares down the rabbit hole of debt with few assets left to sell, low investor confidence, and high household indebtedness. And its economy is at the mercy of its creditors, yet again, on top of everything else, as well as it is at the hands of the homebred and foreign oligarchs. And until the workers of Ukraine are deciding their own destiny, which they haven't for a long time, there will be no justice and no peace in Ukraine. And without empowering the workers and debt forgiveness for the country and household indebtedness, the sovereignty of the country will be fiction, even when military threat is gone. So this is something that is a larger dimension of peace building and reconciliation in Ukraine, is something that needs to be considered. Without these antagonisms along class lines and inequalities and rifts in the society, there can never be any proper meaningful discussion about peaceful resolution and sovereignty restoration. Further complexity, of course, arises from the multi-ethnic and secessional elements in the borders of 2013 Ukraine. And if reconciliation and rebuilding is to happen, it will have to address that complexity in a way of a meaningful compromise. What shape it will take, it is for us to see. But steps need to be made in order to amplify the voices of those whose destiny is being decided. And it shouldn't be left to NATO, it shouldn't be left to Russia, it shouldn't be left to the United States. Because, and this is going to the question of peace, the global dance of might must end. Building up massive arsenals, military alliances, ramping up military production, just in case to deter what might happen, is not working too well, is it? And at the same time, having security guarantors threat you with military aggression and indeed invading your country, which is what happened with Russia and Ukraine when Russia Russia was supposed to guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty and integrity of borders after Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. Well, when your guarantors invade you, it's not a very strong argument in defense of nuclear non-proliferation, which again brings up the global temperature around militarization questions. So while neocolonial and neo-imperialistic nature of Russia's moves is clear, the reasoning behind it is more complex than a simple ambition of might. And while using neighbors as bargaining chips is unacceptable, we can also admit at the same time that the spread of NATO membership and partnerships globally since the fall of USSR has not helped the situation. US and NATO and Russia since the Transnistria crisis and onward have been part of a mutually reinforcing dysregnetic dance where misgivings and missteps of one reinforce the same of another. And the more wounded Russia acted, the more convincing pro-NATO arguments were in the region of Central Eastern Europe and Asia and elsewhere. And the more partners NATO had, the more compelled Russia was to twist the arms of its neighbors. And it just becomes this never-ending self-perpetuating cycle, and that pushing and the bullying of both must stop. There won't be any stability without United States and Russia dialing back security threats and stashing away the weapons and acting together to demilitarize the world globally. And in the case of Ukraine, what we need to be working towards are labor-centric demilitarized solutions, which of course are difficult to envisage right now, but to work out what they might be, a dialogue needs to be made and evidence needs to be collected from what it is that people in Ukraine want, what it is that people in DNR and LNR want, what it is that the people of Crimea want, not what the local oligarchs want, but what kind of future can be built in the territory of what used to be Ukraine in 2013. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. And I agree that there's so many kind of socioeconomic factors that we need to begin incorporating into our ideas of security and what that means. But I'm going to turn to Paul now, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time to discuss many of the questions you raised. Paul, you're muted, unfortunately.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for that. I just want to start by saying, let's be clear about what is happening and what is not happening. What is not happening is US aggression against Russia. You could say that the United States was unwise to offer security guarantees to Ukraine and Georgia after 2008. I think it probably was in the way it was done. But the last three presidents of the United States have shown no interest in confronting Russia geostrategically in the Black Sea region. Indeed, Trump is arguably a proxy for Russian foreign policy. And today, my inbox as a journalist is full of complaints by the traditional neoconservative right in America, the old Cold War, non-Trump conservatives, complaining about what? Biden's multilateralism, Biden's lack of commitment to the defense of Ukraine. So the current US government has no project whatsoever of a military engagement with Russia over Ukraine. Whatever you know, that's can be seen as tragic by some of our Ukrainian colleagues, but that's the case. What is happening, in fact, is a military and geostrategic aggression by Russia against Ukraine. And I say this as someone who is on the left of politics, for whom I think it is very important for us on the left to state this, because there are powerful but small voices who are basically stating a complete fictional account of what's going on. If Vladimir Putin decides to increase, as Dmitri says, there is already hybrid warfare going on. The Russian concept of war since 2015 has been of a new kind in which hybrid can move quite quickly into military action. If Putin decides to turn this into a military offensive to topple the Ukrainian government, it won't be just to demonstrate that might is right. It won't be just in pursuit of the program of soft federation with Russia. The aim will be to demonstrate what a new kind of war looks like. Just as General Franco in 1936-37 was demonstrating in the Spanish Civil War what blitzkrieg looks like, what civilian bombing looks like, what the mass murder of civilians looked like. The world didn't really know that until they saw the Spanish Civil War. I think it's important for Putin. His entire project is focused around the defense of oligarchic economic and political power through the exertion of force. It's very important to him to make Ukraine a success for that. And that is why it's so important for us to mobilize at this stage for peace. The kind of war that will happen is not the kind of war that happened in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's actually more serious, because the aim of new generation warfare, which practiced by all and designed indeed by all major states, is to collapse the infrastructure of the state you're attacking, the victim state, as the Russian military calls it. So what we will see is people rushing to hospitals, rushing to cemeteries and morgues, to supermarkets, to railway stations, to government buildings, saying what's going on, because the internet will be switched off, GPS will be switched off, your cell phone will be switched off. That's the kind of, from day one, that's the kind of war we're looking at. That's before we start with long-range artillery and tanks and anti-tank missiles. And no sane person wants such a war to happen. Everyone, from wherever you're coming from, whether you're a Ukrainian nationalist or a Russian nationalist, or like me, a leftist, we should be thinking really hard, how do we stop this, not how do we start it? Now, anti-war movements, I think, can play a crucial role at two stages in conflicts like this. The stage we're at, where masses of people are starting to understand that this could happen. Most people in this country, where I'm speaking from, London, don't really understand that they could be 3 to 4 weeks away from the first conventional warfare in Europe, full scale, since 1945. They just can't process it. But at that stage, it's often a very narrow window of opportunity to mobilize lots of people who are revolted by the prospect of people like them living in countries like theirs suddenly being hit with Iraq-style, bombardments. And I think we can do that as people become aware of it. Because what we can say in this phase is we have no control. We are mobilizing the civil society groups. And I pay tribute to Alexandra and Dmitri for coming to this call, because they'll be now attacked by nationalists in their own countries saying, you're talking to the enemy. But what we can do is we can speak across borders, as the working class movements did before 1914, to say, we don't want this war. And indeed, realism, whatever my own opinion is of the rights and wrongs of the war, realism compels me to state it can be stopped, even at the cost of diplomatic compromise, because we in civil society have no skin in the game of whether this regiment or this brigade deploys to the front, or whether this group of mercenaries who've been paid thousands of dollars get to kill people. We have no skin in that game. So we have an interest and the ability to demobilize this. But, probably the most we can achieve, if one side is determined to fight, is to place on the record that tens of thousands of people opposed this war, told you it was going to be a disaster, said it would be illegal under international law, just as we did in 2003, by the way, and then leave it for them, the oligarchs and elites of these countries, to face international law and history, because nothing good can come out of the war. The next window of opportunity, unfortunately, lies at the other side of any conflict, when people get sick of it, when they get sick of hearing industrial scale lying, when they get sick of hearing their friends killed. I've been a correspondent in a war. I have sat with my Palestinian translator in Gaza City as he took the real-time call that his best friend had just been killed by the Israelis, a civilian. I can tell you that is a terrible feeling, to be in a situation where nothing you can do can help somebody. And tens of thousands of people are going to go through that unless we stop this. But if it happens, Eventually, even the most bloodthirsty oligarchs get sick of it. And at that point, they ask, well, how do we stop it happening again? How do we stabilize the world? And this has happened 3 times in the last 100 years. After the First World War, the League of Nations and the ill-fated Versailles Treaty. After the Second World War, the United Nations and the modern security architecture around it. Towards the end of the Cold War, and I know Mary is going to talk about this, we had the Helsinki framework, we had the non-proliferation treaties, SALT, MPF, etc. And we came up with what we thought was an architecture to contain the post-Cold War world. If Ukraine and Russia go to war, you could say both the UN framework and the Helsinki framework has fallen apart. We're going to have to create something new. I would like that something new to be with a democratic Russia, with a Russia of multi-party democracy, and a Ukraine which didn't ban opposition parties or hound human rights defenders. But it might have to be with Ukraine and Russia as they're currently led. And so it'll have to be a realistic framework that takes into account the fears that the Russian oligarchy has around NATO expansion. To me, I want to finish on this. As a supporter of Ukrainian self-determination, as a supporter of Ukraine's right to self-defense, the realistic position to take right now is to say this, and I know it's what Biden and Blinken are discussing, but they just can't say it. For Ukraine, it is perfectly correct for NATO to be a defensive alliance. Within the Labour Party, I've been cancelled, hounded, trolled, insulted by that part of the left that supports Vladimir Putin for saying that NATO should be a defensive alliance, that we should remain part of it. It's an important part of the security architecture of the world. But having said that, you cannot simultaneously be a defensive alliance and have an open door policy to states that are currently unstable and non-democratic. Indeed, I would prefer NATO to have a door through which states could exit. States like Recep Tayyip Erdogan's Turkey and indeed Orban's NATO. I think the qualification for being part of that nuclear defensive umbrella should be a stable democracy. Now, I think nothing can stop the Ukrainian people, if they wish, applying for membership, being members, going on a path to membership. Likewise with the EU, I hope they do. But I think we in the metropolitan countries, USA, France, Britain, just have a duty to say, let's take it slowly, let's make it strategic, and let's, in the best possible way, create the conditions for, if Ukraine does want to join NATO, the conditions, the best possible condition is a fully democratic country facing what across the border from Kharkiv, across the border, there should be a democratic Russia. And we have a common interest as the people assembled on this call to mobilize for both those outcomes, for a democratic Russia and for a democratic non-oligarchic Ukraine. I think we can do that. The last time I was in Russia, it seems ages ago now, I was sent by the British Council, now closed down. But I met hundreds of young people who wanted a democratic Russia, who'd been involved in the White Ribbon movement, who'd been involved in the aftermath, who wanted to hear me speak about network to democracy. We know it's there. We know also that there are many non-liberal democratic movements. We need to talk to them. So to finish here, we need to warn. We're not just pleading with the oligarchs and the militarists on all sides. We need to warn them. If they think that going to war to solve this problem of international tension ends the era of so-called color revolutions, which is what Putin and Xi Jinping are obsessed with avoiding, ending color revolutions. It will not. You know, if you occupy Ukraine with probably a third of the population prepared to take up arms and already organizing territorial defense way beyond the so-called right sector, far-right groups who are already doing it, if you occupy Ukraine, Vladimir Putin, you will face a color revolution in Ukraine. It's very simple, and it will go on. And I think it's quite likely that you will destabilize your own country. And indeed, the message to all of Putin's supporters here, Nazarbayev, Xi Jinping, don't teach us how to fight you, because we can, and I believe should, mobilize a mass movement across borders to demand peace, demand to enter the diplomacy with menaces, and build cross-border solidarity with those groups who can make a democratic Ukraine, a democratic Kazakhstan, a democratic Russia, a democratic China a reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And there's already been quite a few questions that have come off just from things that you've been saying. And I encourage all the attendees to also use the Q&A function, because it means that your question is going to stay there and it's going to be visible and it's not going to get lost in the chat. I'm going to rush over to Alvaro. We have Alvaro and then Mary, and then hopefully we'll be able to unpick some of the loads of interesting points that the people are throwing into the discussion. Alvaro, over to you. Sorry, Alvaro, you're on mute.
Sorry. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be in this debate. Thank you very much for the invitation. What I was trying to do, and hearing our colleagues from Ukraine and Russia, is why there is no peace movement in Europe against this war, why the anti-war movement is not in the streets. And I'm in Portugal, far away from Russia, in the other extreme of Europe. And we are having now an electoral campaign. And there is no debate in the campaign about Ukraine, not about the possibility of war. War became something unthinkable in Western Europe. Penser la guerre, c'est penser l'impossible, as the French say. We don't realize that war is possible, because all we have done in this year was to integrate Western Europe through democratic means, and this is also the Portuguese experience of democratic transformation and revolution and integration in Europe. We have created an area of peace and democracy where war is impossible. We don't think even on war. And it was this project of war, of peace and democracy without war, and through economic development, that we are trying to move towards the East. And we have seen this process of enlargement of the European Union to the East, and this area of peace and democracy being developed. And this, I think, is what Russia is afraid of, is the integration of Ukraine in this area of peace and democracy, of stable democracies. That is the counter-project of what has become Russia. Russia, unfortunately, is no more part of this project. We thought in the 90s that Russia would also be part of this process of enlargement, of integration, of peace and democracy. It's no more the case. Russia is the counter-project, is where nationalism became the dominant ideology. And for Russia, the destruction of the European Union, of the European Union project, is of course of great strategic interest. And I think that what we need to realize today is that war is possible. Even if there is an incursion, that you had this discussion, Biden saying that if it is just a short incursion in Ukraine, perhaps it's not a big problem. But we know that this is not the case. That if there is a military incursion, even if it is a limited one, we don't know where that will stop. And that if that will not bring by escalation a war, again in Europe, a conventional war of a very large scale. And we should be very concerned with that. But unfortunately, we are not. And we are not mobilized to do that. And I think mobilization could come as support to mobilization in Ukraine. If I can give this, if there is real mobilization in Ukraine against war, if the people that would be in the streets of Ukraine opposing the idea of a war, this will call for support in Western Europe. And it will be easier to mobilize the Western European civil society. Also, the European Union politicians want to think about everything else than the possibility of a war. And so they are making, of course, they are concerned what's happening in Ukraine. They are taking positions here and there, but they are not coming with a very strong position. And my understanding, my concern, is that nationalism is not just a Russian problem. Nationalism is today a problem all over Europe. You have nationalistic parts in all European Union countries. And the victory of Russian nationalism is victory of Le Pen, of Orban, of Salvini, of the extreme right in Portugal and Spain. Everywhere in Europe, you have the same problem. So it's the future of the European Union is at stake, in my opinion, in this conflict in Ukraine. It's not just the future of Ukraine. And this is what we should make very clear, that it's not just the future of a free society in Ukraine and a sovereign society in Ukraine. It's the future of the European Union itself that is at stake. And this is not clear at all. People discuss about Donbass, about Ukraine, about the problems there, but not the overall European problem with nationalism. Nationalism that is supported directly by Putin. You have seen Putin supporting financially the campaign of Marine Le Pen in France and elsewhere. So it's a very large European question. It's a global European question. And the European Union, I have to close my comments, I think the European Union needs to do 2 or 3 things. One is to get united on this question and to make clear what will be the price that Russia will pay if it intervenes militarily, being in a limited way or overall way in Ukraine. And there the question is not France, it's Germany. Some people are saying the problem is France. No, France is calling for dialogue. It's calling for a new European architecture that perhaps makes sense, that will integrate some of the Russian security concerns. But France is deploying already force in Romania. The problem is in Germany. It's the Social Democratic Party in Germany that is not prepared to take a strong measures, in particular, everything that is linked to the Nord Stream gas pipeline, that the Social Democratic Party is not prepared to get rid of it and to put this in the sanctions list of the European Union. So there is not unity in this moment in the European Union. And the problem is in Germany in relation to the European unity in this moment. So the first thing we need is to be able to get the European unity. The second is to make clear that more important for Ukraine than to become member of NATO, what I personally don't think it's a good idea, to make my point clear. It's very important for Ukraine to have a European perspective, a perspective of integration in the European Union. And that the European Union should do all it can financially, and you have seen this discussion now in the European Union, is the European Union prepared to support financially Ukraine at the level that Ukraine needs? European Union also needs to support rule of law in Ukraine, the protection of the rights of minorities. All that is will be part of the negotiation between the European Union and Ukraine. Human rights should be at the center also of these conversations between the European Union and Ukraine. So that's the second thing the European Union should do. Make clear what are the perspectives and the relations with Ukraine and deepen the relations with Ukraine at this moment itself. Make it clear at this moment. And third, not least, I was very surprised the other day to hear the Secretary General of the United Nations saying that the United Nations is not at all involved in any initiative, in any discussion on the crisis in Ukraine. And I remember, of course, all of us who have read history, who have studied history, what happened to the Society of Nations in 1935 when Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. It was the end of the Society of Nations. It's very strange that the United Nations is not involved. And of course, this means we know that there is other OSCE initiatives, and Mary will speak certainly also about that. But in reality, I think the European Union should bring this to the United Nations level. And there is a number of European Union member states that are members of the Security Council at this moment of the United Nations. And they should bring the question to the Security Council of the United Nations. And this is, I think, is also very important to the peace movement. Because I have seen in the press that a sector of the left that is unable to confront Putin, that still thinks that Russia is in a certain sense a socialist country, even a communist country. So strange to see the left supporting Putin. But still, I see this in the Portuguese debate and the European debate. The other side, the other day, Mélenchon gave an interview to a French, to Le Monde, and he showed his support to Putin policy in Ukraine, which absolutely, very strange for someone who considers himself part of the left. But if we bring the question to the United Nations, this will be important to give legitimacy to all the movement against the war in Ukraine. So 3 proposals, 4 proposals. 1, Ukrainians, mobilize your civil society and we'll support you the most we can. And we'll go to the streets to support you. The other way around is not going to happen, unfortunately. Second, the European Union should unite and make clear the kind of sanctions it will take against Russia. Third, Ukraine negotiations deepen the relations with Ukraine. Now announce it that we are going to deepen. And fourth, bring the question to the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alvaro, and thank you for so clearly summarizing your points in the end as well. And I'm sure people will want to come back to some of those ideas. And finally, Mary, over to you. Mary, you're on mute.
Well, we've just heard some really great interventions, and I think this is an incredibly important meeting because we are at an extraordinarily dangerous moment in the development of Europe. I want to say, first of all, that I think the cause is the new type of authoritarianism exemplified by Putin, that is the combination of crony capitalism, oligarchy, and nationalism. And we don't only see it in Russia, we see it in Poland, we see it in Hungary, we see it in Brexit, we see it in Trump. And that kind of authoritarianism is not just a domestic problem, it's an international problem. We can only understand what Putin is doing in that he does not want to see democracy in Ukraine. That's the problem. He does not want to see democracy in Russia. He does not want to see the end of oligarchy or the exposure of the crimes that are involved in oligarchy. Does the West have any responsibility for this, given that we see the same phenomenon in the West, in Le Pen, in Brexit, and so on? I think that NATO expansion was a mistake. I think the continued armament of the West, including nuclear weapons, was a mistake. Many of us hoped at the end of the Cold War we would create a new European security system based on human rights. Nevertheless, I think that's a pretext for Russia. It's not the cause. What I think is more of a responsibility is the ideology of market fundamentalism that we experienced in the West, and we experienced and was imposed on the Soviet Union, although it was welcomed by many, at least those who became very rich. I think there was a view somehow that we introduced the market and we would transition from a centrally planned economy, from totalitarianism to bourgeois capitalism. In fact, the transition was to kleptocratic oligarchy. And in that sense, it was a huge problem, but not only the West's problem. The second thing I really wanted to say was about the nature of this war. You know, I don't think if the war does begin, and it looks incredibly likely, somehow all those troops amassed on the Ukraine border will have acquired a sort of momentum of their own. But I don't think there are going to be clear victors or clear losers. I take Paul's point about a new type of war, but nevertheless, it's going to be like the other new types of war, only worse. There will be Ukrainian resistance, just as there was Afghan and Iraqi resistance, and it will be stronger than in Iraq or Afghanistan, because if you remember, in those places, it didn't begin at once. At least at first, people welcomed the American presence. And what I think you're likely to get is a long process of ongoing violence, which is incredibly difficult to end. We've reached a point in the development of technology that there isn't that much difference between very advanced technology and not very advanced technology. There isn't that much difference between the improvised explosives that are possessed by Afghan militias and American sophisticated weapons. And the result is a very long war in which a lot of nasty people benefit. And in a way, maybe that is what Putin hopes for. I don't know that he's thought it through in that way, but his interest is destabilization. It's continued tension, because that's how he stays in power. And my fear is that this will be very destructive, very nasty, and very, very difficult to end. So let me my final point, talk about what is the process through which it can end. And part of the process is an anti-war movement and civil society. And we know from conflicts in other places that the level of what I call civicness, the level of civil society and civic activism, is incredibly important in resisting this type of violence. But I also think we have to think about the content of dialogue. Paul mentioned the Helsinki process. In 1975, an agreement was reached among all the countries of Europe and North America called the Helsinki Agreement, and it had three components. The first component was the territorial status quo in Europe, security, prevention of war. The second component was economic and social cooperation, and the third component was human rights. And I think the signing of the Helsinki Agreement was really the beginning of the end of the Cold War. At that time, the Soviet Union signed on to human rights provisions thinking it wouldn't really matter. But as it happened, it did matter, because activists built on those human rights provisions and started campaigning. I think those three components amount to what I usually call human security. We didn't call it that then, but it's about the idea that we're going to shift from a nationally based security, national security based on war fighting and armies and the protection of borders and states, to a human rights-based security where we recognize that we're only secure if everybody's secure, where we recognize that it's the security of individuals that matter, of migrants, of displaced persons, of Russians, of Ukrainians, of British people, and that we can't be secure unless we support each other. So what would it mean now to have a dialogue about these issues? I am in favor of a dialogue, even if it may be too late. But I think it needs to have similarly three components. I think the first component is to prevent war. And there, the most important aspect is being defensive. I think it's too late to stop NATO's expansion. We can't possibly say that Ukraine or Georgia are not allowed to join NATO, but NATO could shift towards a defensive human security-based strategy, could shift away from offensive weapons like nuclear weapons towards a purely defensive posture. And that was something that some of us talked about in the last years of the Cold War. And I think that would make a big sort of difference in the mix. The second component is economic and social cooperation. We have to cooperate about the pandemic. We have to cooperate about climate change. We have no choice. And so I think that second component has to be in the mix, because we live in a world where we don't only have existential threats from war, we have existential threats from pandemics and from climate change, and indeed from extreme poverty. And I'm totally in agreement with Alvaro, by the way, that Nord Stream 2 should be part of the sanctions. And I think we should be against it, not just because of the sanctions, but on climate change grounds as well. And the final component is human rights, which is absolutely crucial, because in the end, the only way we can get peace in Europe is to get rid of this new form of authoritarianism. And I think it's human rights that just has not been part of the mix up till now. Russia is part of the Council of Europe. Russia is part of the OSCE, which is committed to human rights. I would just like to see much more focus on the human rights elements of any future agreement and the mechanisms that we could introduce to do that. And I hope such a framework could be a European framework, but definitely, as Alvaro puts it, should be part of the United Nations too. So I hope this rally, this meeting, is the beginning of a longer discussion and a greater mobilization to try to stop war in Europe. Because even if Russians don't win, even if we do see this long sort of violence, it's going to spread. And we could end up in what I call a sort of new war, a pan-European new war, which would be incredibly difficult to end. So I've ended on a bad note. I mean, to end on a positive note, let's try and organize against this.
Well, it's difficult. I think, Mary, it's difficult to hit a positive note given the gravity of the situation. And I think many people have made the point, not just from the panel, but also from the comments in the chat, and it's been very lively, that we need to stop thinking about this in future terms and talking about it in future terms, because this is a situation that people in different regions, not just in Ukraine, are living through and have been living through for years. So the destabilization, the conflict, the war, in whatever great gradation of that term you envisage, is happening and is being waged against people and against their rights. So we've heard excellent opening remarks, and as is usually the case with these meetings, we don't have that much as much time for discussion as we would like to. But we do have many questions. Many questions were raised in the Q&A function as well, and I would encourage panelists, if you want to answer something that's on the Q&A, feel free to type it as well. But I'm going to take a question from the floor, and I see Luke Cooper has raised a hand, so I'm going to let him speak. Wait, he disappeared. There he is. Hi, Luke. Hello.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi,
Yep.
everyone. Thanks so much to all of the speakers for their contribution. I really like Dmitri's emphasis that we need to break out of the framework that says West good, East bad. And I think what's exciting about this platform and this initiative that people are taking to organize across borders is that we can try to establish, as Paul Mason argued, the basis for a new internationalism, a new, like Helsinki 2.0, if you like. And I just wanted to also agree with the panelists or those that are on the panel that said, you know, in hindsight, the expansion of NATO has to be seen as a historic error. And I think it's worth asking what the root of that error was. And I think because it gives us a sense of what we need to try and move away from. And it's the viewing of the world as spheres of influence to some degree. I think inadvertently at the time in the 1990s, but that was the effect of it. And in its own way, and I'm not saying they're equivalent, it does share Putin's view of the world, right? He views the world as spheres of influence to be carved up by great powers. And I think the conclusion for that, or from that analysis, has to be, you know, yes, we have to support Ukrainian self-determination, just like we have to support all states' freedom to run their own affairs on the basis, on some kind of freedom from foreign influence and interference. And that can be the basis with a human rights agenda for the kind of model of global governance that a Helsinki 2.0, a global civil society process, can put forward.
Thanks very much, Luke. Sorry, I seem to be having a delayed sound, but hopefully that's just interfering with my experience of the meeting and not everyone else. Okay, so I'm gonna take a question from the Q&A as well, and then we can get back to the speakers, and we can summarize along many of the points that have been raised already. So given the state of where we are at, I guess the most pressing question is, how do we build and what kind of anti-war movement does this moment require? How do we build it? How do we support what is already happening in Ukraine? What is already happening in various regions experiencing destabilization? What is it that we can offer as civil society, not on the front line, let's say? And I'm gonna go back to our panelists in the order that you originally spoke to address these or any other points from what others have said. So over to you, Alexandra.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the audience to share their remarks and questions. I wish I have an answer to majority of them. It's very important discussion, and I listen with interest to the points of speakers, but I'm very sad. I would like to be honest, because all the question which we raise needs a time, and I don't know how much time do we have. Since the beginning of the war, I documented war crime, and I think that it's good to understand the practical meaning of the war is. And in order to do it, I would like to ask the audience, put the plus in the chat for those people who know how to live in the war condition, who know what it means to happen the injured people, or who know what it means to try to help the people who survive from the hostage. If there are some people in our audience who went such kind of experience, please put plus in the chat, just for me to understand how much people who knows the experience of Ukrainians who live in such condition for 8 years. And as for me, as I told, I focused on defending human rights, and regardless of the sides, and our focus is working with civilians who were victims of abduction and tortures and killings in hostages. And I spoke with hundreds and hundreds of women and men, once again, mostly civilians, who were raped, who were beaten, whose fingers were cut, whose eyes were pulled out with spoons, who were smashed into wooden boxes, who were tortured by electricity. So the war have a very concrete forms, and it's very horrible forms. And we can discuss what can be done in future, but something can be done now, because I know for sure that this practice, if the new Russian invasion will happen, will widespread to the new region of Ukraine. And my task as a human rights defender to prevent them and to save the people's life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Dmitri.
Yeah, well, I think Alexandra has made it quite evident. I mean, the tragedy of the whole situation, right? And the pain and the suffering that the people living in a war zone, not only in Ukraine, but in other parts of Europe, are experiencing. So for them, it is a question of urgency, and you can understand the rage and the impatience that they feel, including about the diplomatic big talk. But in the long run, I mean, we need to transform that pain and that rage into a will to come out of it as a better kind of international society. We need institutions that can react to those injustices, right? It can somehow maybe compensate people for it if it's at all possible, and in ideal run prevent it. And all the institutions that we mentioned in this talk are not capable of doing so. Neither the UN, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, all those who have, especially the last two, human rights among the goals of the establishment, of the functioning. And I think that's also a huge tragedy. And if you look at the priorities, the real priorities of so-called democratic states, I mean, you just have to look at the budgets of the European Union and the budgets of the Council of Europe, for instance, which is a pan-European organization focused specifically on human rights, specifically on rule of law, not on the common market, not on the common, exchange of goods, but specifically on those issues that can help somehow react to the injustices that Alexander and other human rights defenders are talking about and fighting against. And the priorities are not there. And despite all the diplomatic hard stance and all the calls for sanctions, how many war criminals from the Chechen war, for example, were actually sanctioned, including the ones who were labeled as war criminals by the European Court of Human Rights, for instance? Not so many, because for many European politicians that want to take a hard stance, for them it's just like you have to say that we're doing something without actually thinking about the effects. In doing something, it's kind of like you take a stand, but it doesn't transform into real political will. There are no actions in the legal field. There are a few actions in the diplomatic field, and that's when the military starts talking. And then the military starts talking, the law is silent and human rights are violated. Regardless whether it's a war for a just cause, as seen by many, whether it's a war for unjust cause, people still suffer. So for us, as human rights activists, as peace activists, I guess we have to work towards the solutions that do not involve military engagement. As hard as it may sound, and as justful as it may seem for many who call for revenge or call for rightful self-defense, in an ideal world, we should all be left behind. And I guess that's a challenge that we are facing now. And once more, I mean, the Helsinki framework, which has been referenced here, was a great achievement in many ways, not only because it framed those things, but also because it gave a space, or more exactly, the civil society took the space to transform those commitments into real actions, at least at that point of history. Now the question is, can we transform the current commitments that the states continue to declare into strengthening of human rights institutions, into real support for the human rights and movements and civil society, because the will is not there, but so is the political, the pressure from the civil society is also not really there. We're not speaking to that means, unfortunately, yet.
Thank you, Dmitri. And I think a lot of these kind of points are echo. Well, they definitely echo with those of us who happen to live in the UK, where even the notion of human rights and legislation around human rights is also increasingly up for debate. So it's obviously completely on a different scale, but it is a crisis of more than just two political actors that we're discussing. Before I go back to Yulia, I just wanted to make sure I flag something before I forget. It slips my mind. For those of you who are asking what can I do and who want to express solidarity in some form, there is a demonstration on Monday, the 31st of January, organized by the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign in London, and I'm going to post more details about it in the chat. But I think Yulia is also involved with the campaign, and I'm sure can respond to any questions about people who want to organize further for activities like that. But over to you, Yulia.
Thank you very much, Ilona. Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you, Dmitri. And Alexandra, I'm really grateful for what you have said, because I think the gravity of this situation as it currently is something that sort of escapes a lot of discussion because it's unsavory, it's very traumatic, and you know, we try to generally, a lot of conversations tend to focus on the so-called bigger picture, but there are actual human lives that are being destroyed, souls that are, and families that are being ripped apart. And that is something that really has to force us to think about, you know, when we've been asked about what solutions can there be and what actions are to be taken, we need to think about the immediate, the existing, as well as large scale and long term. And I cannot even imagine what you deal with on a daily basis. I've only been for 1 week in May of 2015 in Shasty and Trihizbinka in Lugansk Oblast on what's Ukrainian part of the border. And that was enough to kind of get a tiny bit of sense of the magnitude of what you were saying. But again, just the tiny bit of sense, I cannot fathom that. But back to the question, I think when we're thinking what can and should be done, first of all, there are these immediate actions that need to be taken place while more long-term plans on various terrains need to be thought through. And and when we're talking about effects of the conflict on whatever side of the border, we need to be thinking not just about what might happen, but what is already happening. And it is voices of people like you, Alexandra, and organizations who are engaged in similar action, your experiences, who need to frame what that response should be. It shouldn't be people like me who makes those decisions, because I simply do not know. So I will not be speaking to that. Just the time frame is all I can say. But what I will speak to is the centrality of labor-based, including security of labor, military and social security, and that kind of coming back to human rights as the frameworks that need to be absolute, as the principles that need to be central to any solutions that that are to be designed, any responses, and any kind of anti-war response. Because to me, I'm a political economist, and to me, military conflicts are always an extension of economic conflicts. They do not come out of nowhere. They are not a whim. And to that end, what Mary, you were saying towards the end, and what Alvaro was saying about the rise of nationalism with the military hand, the kind of escalation of geopolitical tensions is very central, but it is not accidental. It goes to the very beginning and the premise of capitalist market economies. It's right there in Adam Smith when he writes about civil magistrate, the precursor of what is now the state institution, where the role of the civil magistrate, the advocate of free markets, was assigning it to protect private property from the poor mob. And this is the fundamental premise. We have disempowered, impoverished people in Russia, in Ukraine, in Britain, in Transnistria, in Germany, in Portugal, who are against global oligarchs and the institution of the nation state that are working more and more every year, and they're utilizing the nationalist rhetoric, and we see it in Britain with Brexit, to further curtail any rights of individual citizens, of labor in the Marxist sense, as in non-capitalists, those who do not own factories and millions in offshore. So now we see that once the frontier where accumulation of capital is closing, we need to start closing the borders so people cannot move as easily, so that the labor is further controlled. And we see that with Ukraine, where millions of people are pushed out of the country to seek better fortune elsewhere, work in dehumanizing conditions. That is all part of the same big story of state and capital working together. And we cannot guarantee, and I'm going to stop at that, with what we can work on, and what's also part of a bigger picture work against, for human rights and against wars internationally. We need to work internationally to empower workers, get rid of oligarchs internationally, and military organizations that are there guarding their interests at expense of security, military and social security globally. I'm going to end at that. Then human rights will be protected. There is no human rights when there is so-called free market, because it's never free. It's capitalist enterprise free from scrutiny of those who are making it money. And that is what we need to be fighting. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Solidarity. Over to Paul for summarizing, addressing some of the questions that have been raised, and there's been quite a lot of comments directly relating to what you were speaking about earlier, Paul. Obviously, we don't have that much time to cover everything, but if you can unmute, please.
I mean, there's not enough time to cover all. Some of the questions are really fundamental and excellent. All I want to say is that ordinary people have much more power in conflict situations than is obvious. Every conflict in the 20th century ended in quasi-revolutionary outcomes. And it may not need a revolution to democratize rapidly some of the countries that will be drawn into this. I just want to make clear that, yes, they can shut down the internet. Yes, they can shut down, cell phone data temporarily. But if that happens, I just don't think most of these oligarchs and kind of siloviki, the security elite on all sides, understand how revolted ordinary people are by the kind of conflict which Alexandra explained the outcomes of. Again, as a reporter, I've seen it wherever I go, wherever there is conflict. All of these things, human rights violations, sexual violence, organized sexual violence, torture, always happen because the world is full of assholes, to be honest, and particularly ones with power. And people do not like it. I think what I'm trying to do here is really I'm raising the specter for these oligarchs, that the world ends up worse for them after a war that they begin than it is before. That's the only weapon ordinary people have when these military industrial machines decide to go to war against each other. No matter what the rights and wrongs, and I believe there are profound rights on the side of Ukraine here if a war takes place. I'll just finally just say one thing about what's happening right now, because there's been some questions about what's going on now. The deployment of defensive anti-tank missiles, first of all by America and now by Britain bilaterally into Ukraine, it's a confidence building measure. I'm sure it will make many of the civil defense volunteers and some of the Ukrainian army feel more confident, but they'll be useless against the kind of material that Vladimir Putin's military have to throw against the Ukrainian military. They will kill some Russian soldiers, they will stop some Russian tanks, but it won't fundamentally alter the balance. The thing that would fundamentally alter the balance is if Ukraine had a navy. It doesn't. People in the comments are saying the West is surrounding Russia. I'm sorry, the West has, if West wanted to surround Russia, it would send a navy into the Black Sea. It doesn't have a navy into the Black Sea. It's not surrounded. Likewise in the Baltic Sea. So we just need to be understanding that probably there's no weapon powerful enough to defeat what Russia could throw at the Ukrainian people, conventional weapon. But the weapon that could completely change the game is mass mobilization across borders between working people.
Thank you, Paul, and a much more, constructive weapon, let's say, the mobilization of working people rather than conventional weaponry. Alvaro, if you'd like to come back to any of the points that other panelists or some of the questions from the audience have been raised, and just a reminder, this is not going to be the last time we meet or the last time we discuss this. This is just the beginning.
Of course. Thank you. First, I think what is at the heart of our discussion on the panel is how to link the short term, the immediate needs of peace, and to confront the Russian military pressure and eventually military intervention, and the long-term objectives of peace in Europe, European integration, democracy. And that's the difficulty, how to combine both. So I would say to start, and answering to one of the questions you raised and many people raised, is if we need to know better what is happening in Ukraine, what is happening in the regions of Donbass, and what Alexandra told us could be the base for civil society mobilization across Europe. So I have a concrete suggestion, is Alexandra, if you raise what are your needs, what you think are the needs of civil society in Ukraine at this specific moment, to confront the threat of war and to mobilize the Ukrainian civil society to face those threats, and you share among us, we could convene this to our governments, to the European Union authorities, to the European Union institutions, and try to find more support for your fight in Ukraine. Because in fact, what we can do in Western Europe is to support what you are trying to do. And that's a concrete proposal that I would left. Share with us, please, what are your basic ideas, your fundamental needs, and we'll do our best to support you. At the same time, in this short term, I would suggest that we transform this conversation in a very large network of civil society organizations. Not only the civil society organizations that are linked to the peace movement, but others. In our country, there's a lot of different civil society organizations that are engaged in democratic support, in European integration, that are concerned with the future of the European Union. And we could enlarge this process create a platform, another Europe and European alternatives could be that platform where we would link other organizations that would support what you are trying to do in sport for our Ukrainian colleagues. Now, just two short comments on the global picture. One is the deep roots of this problem. That is important also for the European debate. I understand, or I try to, it seems to be, that this process of a common European home that was proposed by Gorbachev, that could be developed in the base of democracy and economic development, was destroyed in Russia because of the neoliberal proposals that were put to Yeltsin, and that create this situation of oligarchy with a nationalistic project. And we must make clear that it's not only the problem of Donbass, it's not just the problem of Ukraine, that nationalism is war. And I think this should be our slogan of this, this debate. Nationalism means war. And there are nationalists in all European Union countries. That brings our together. That makes my fight in Portugal against the extreme right in Portugal the same fight than the Ukrainians or the Russians against the extreme right and nationalism in Russia. And I think that's very important that Russians are part of this conversation. Russia is an essential part of the solution. The Russians are essential to the solution of this long-term solution of this problem. And Russian destiny, the democratic Europe, should be our aim. I am an utopian, so I still believe in a full integrated democratic Europe, where Russia will be part of it. And all what they are doing today has that objective at long term, the full involvement of Russia and of the Russians in our project. And finally, for the UN, that we didn't deepen what the UN could do and what the European Union could propose. But if Donbass is at the heart of the problem today, why not a peacekeeping mission with a human security that Mary Calder will certainly support in Donbass? Why there is no peacekeepers inside Donbass? Because the Russians don't want, because the situation is so difficult that it's impossible. But that's what should be discussed at the UN, and the UN Secretary General should indicate a special representative that does not exist, what is extraordinary, to the Ukrainian crisis. And he could take initiatives like starting discussing with the Russians the possibility of a peacekeeping operation in Donbass. Perhaps this is not going to happen, but will be part of the discussion. I will support there, but I think that the UN is fundamental to legitimate our action. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thanks to you, our colleagues from Ukraine for bringing, and from Russia for bringing this insight and this need for our sport. We are fully supporting you as much as we can, from Portugal to elsewhere in Europe. I am in Portugal, I can speak from Portuguese, but not all of them, certainly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alvaro. And I think Alexander has already agreed to convey some ideas and suggestions to us that we can take forward, which will be much appreciated, and I'm sure lots of us will have ideas on how to contribute further. I also want to stress the point that you're making, that of course Russian people are very much part of this conversation, need to be considered, and their needs and their rights also need to be considered, and their rights are also infringed on by being dragged into conflict and into war. So finally, we're going to hear from Mary Calder, who will give the ending rallying remarks on today's meeting. But once again, I say this is not going to be the last time we meet.
Thank you, Elena. And first, very briefly, I think conventional military force is hugely destructive nowadays, but it's not very good at what the American strategist Thomas Schelling called compellence. It's a very blunt instrument, and it's not very good at making people do what you want it to do. And that's where the anti-war movement comes in, because it's frustrating the sort of political aims that is really possible. So that's one point I wanted to make. The second point is that I agree totally with Alvaro about the UN, and I'd like to see a much stronger EU role. European Alternatives is part of this rally, and I think some people from European Alternatives are here. I think European Alternatives could do a lot with us pushing the EU to take a unified and much stronger and much more human rights-based position. Finally, on what we do, there is an appeal, and actually this rally was supposed to launch our appeal. I don't know if I think we could put the appeal in the chat, and we could also circulate it to everybody. I think collecting signatures for the appeal is our way we could construct our new network. And I think what we should do is to build this network, build on information and proposals from Alexandra and also from Dmitri. I completely agree with Alvaro about this is a struggle against authoritarianism worldwide. You know, if the Second World War, the resistance was really a struggle against fascism, this is a struggle against this new horrible form of nationalist authoritarianism. And so we're creating this pan-European civic network. And, you know, the more that people can start discussions in their local areas, the more that this can spread, the more that we can put pressure on our members of parliament. We in another Europe will keep you informed. But this is the way to go forward. And I'm really glad that there were so many people here today. And I hope it will be the beginning of the kind of anti-war movement that Paul and others were calling for.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thanks everyone for joining in. We are only 15 minutes over time, which, given my appalling timekeeping, usually this is actually an achievement. But as Mary mentioned, we do have a statement that will be emailed to everyone who registered for the event. And the recording of today's meeting is also going to be live on YouTube. You can share it, and in fact, please do share it and encourage more people to join in this conversation. We need to bear in mind that we're, as I said, we're not going to agree 100% on tactics. We're not going to agree 100% on strategy. But as long as we agree that peace is something you work for, and it's worth working for, then we can take this further. Once again, a reminder, there is a solidarity action on Monday if you happen to be in London, and do follow the Ukraine Solidarity campaign as well for other activities you can join in. But this was just the first chapter in our conversation around this crisis. So for now, good night, and see you soon. Solidarity and best wishes to everyone. Thank you for our speakers again.
Thank you.